Pick that up, sweetheart." That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 minutes before the Black Hawk landed on St. Michael's helipad. The fluorescent lights of the emergency department hum with mechanical indifference as Katie Morrison moves through her third shift at St. Michael's in Philadelphia, her scrubs faded navy, her name badge clipped crooked and revealing nothing. The antiseptic smell cuts through the waiting room like a blade, sharp, clinical, the kind of sterile that comes from 8 hours of bleach and broken bodies. She refills supply carts with steady hands, arranging gauze and 4 kits in perfect rows while other nurses gossip near the coffee station, their voices a backdrop of complaint and speculation about the new hire nobody asked for. The charge nurse had introduced her that morning with the enthusiasm of someone announcing a dental procedure. "This is Katie. She's in orientation. Be nice." Nobody had asked where Katie came from. Nobody had asked why there were no social media profiles, no LinkedIn history stretching back 7 years, no traces of employment before St. Michael's. The absence of a past is invisible to people who've never had to hide one. Room 347 sits at the end of the east corridor, the sunlight through the window making the tile floor gleam like ice. A wheelchair-bound patient named Martinez occupies the bed, his chart noting a Purple Heart, a special forces background that ended in a roadside explosion outside Marja 4 years ago. His legs were the price. What nobody writes in hospital records is what he keeps beside his bed, a pair of worn combat boots. Scuffed leather. Frayed laces. The kind that walked through Helmand Province dust, that kicked down doors in Sanjan Valley, that stood in formations Katie used to lead. Katie's eyes linger on those boots for 3 seconds too long before she checks his vitals without a word. Her hands move on muscle memory, cuff around the upper arm, 90 seconds, blood pressure 120/78, strong and steady like the man attached to them. She records the numbers in his chart without lifting her gaze. "You knew." Martinez's voice carries the rasp of someone who's learned to speak around pain. "Yes, sir." "Don't call me sir. Call me Martinez." She nods. She doesn't explain that sir is the only word that feels safe anymore, the only social contract that translates across worlds. In the ER, everyone is a patient. In the uniform she hasn't worn in 8 years, everyone was either a team member or command. There is no middle ground for people like her. Dr. Whitfield watches from the nurse's station. He's observing the way Katie inserts an 4 on the first stick while 2 residents fumble with the patient next door, 3 attempts, 2 blown veins, the kind of incompetence that gets complaints filed. His gaze is calculating, the way a predator measures prey. He leans toward the charge nurse and murmurs something about wondering how long she'll last, and the charge nurse glances at Katie with newfound skepticism, the kind that spreads like contamination through hospital hierarchies. Katie's jaw tightens imperceptibly as she logs medication times, her pen forming letters with military precision, each digit exact, each notation a perfect corner of evidence that she knows what she's doing. Whitfield is 37, Ivy League educated, with a $12,000 Omega Seamaster on his wrist and a conspiracy that nets him $42,000 per month. The network is simple. He approves purchase orders for medical equipment from a company called Helix Surgical Solutions. Helix bills for equipment that doesn't exist, ventilators, dialysis machines, monitor stands, at triple markup. The money flows from the hospital's accounts to Helix's shell corporation to 3 bank accounts in Grand Cayman. It's been running for 18 months without friction because Whitfield has cultivated allies, 2 board members who owe him investment tips that turned into 7-figure gains, and a CFO who looks the other way because her nephew got a full scholarship to Penn because Whitfield wrote a recommendation. The system works because nobody audits it. Nobody questions it. Nobody looks twice at the requisitions because they come from the chief of emergency medicine, and his word carries the weight of a man who knows exactly how to weaponize institutional trust. What Whitfield doesn't account for is that Katie spent 8 years running supply chains in forward operating bases where every dollar was auditable, where phantom equipment meant soldiers died with the wrong medication, where her signature on a form meant she was responsible for the life attached to it. He doesn't know that in Marja she requisitioned medical supplies for a 40-person team in a compound with walls made of stacked sandbags. He doesn't know that she cross-referenced inventory 3 times a day. He doesn't know that she is the kind of person who catches discrepancies the way other people catch colds. By the end of her first shift, Katie has already noticed that the number of 14-gauge angiocath needles the ER requisitions doesn't match the number the staff actually uses. The heart monitors don't match the billing records. The 4 fluids are ordered in quantities that exceed usage by approximately 23%. She doesn't mention it. Not yet. The break room smells like burned coffee and the particular despair that comes from fluorescent lighting at 3 in the afternoon. 7 other staff members are scattered across the room, 2 nurses, 1 paramedic, 3 residents, and Dr. Whitfield, who leans against the refrigerator with the posture of a man who owns the space. Katie is making tea because coffee has become a trigger, a sensory reminder of caves in Cunha province where she performed emergency procedures on soldiers with names she wasn't supposed to remember. Chamomile is safer. Chamomile is civilian. I'm taking bets, Whitfield announces to the room. $50 says our new nurse quits before Friday. What do you say? Anybody want to cover that? The room goes very quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before something breaks. Katie doesn't turn around. Her hand is steady as she pours hot water into her mug. The steam rises in delicate patterns, and she watches it dissipate the way she once watched smoke from distant explosions, cataloging trajectory and wind direction. Muscle memory is a disease. Even in Philadelphia, she calculates angles. I'll take that bet, one of the residents says, clearly uncomfortable but also trapped in the social obligation of not appearing weak. She seems competent. Competence and staying power are different things, Whitfield says. His voice is warm, conversational, the kind that makes cruelty sound like observation. Look at her. Quiet. No connections. Probably some personal issue nobody wants to discuss. They always quit when the pressure builds. New nurses without support networks don't last. Katie's jaw tightens. She adds honey to her tea. She doesn't speak. The room absorbs his words like paper absorbs blood. Nobody contradicts him. Whitfield has written letters of recommendation for 2 of the residents. Whitfield's opinions on clinical competence determine who gets selected for the competitive fellowship programs. Whitfield is a man whose words carry institutional weight, and institutional weight is how you build allies in a system designed to punish dissent. Katie removes her tea bag. She turns. She looks at him for exactly 2 seconds. Her expression is a flat surface, the kind that gives nothing back. Then she walks past him out of the break room. The trembling isn't fear. It is restraint. It is the discipline of someone who once led soldiers through territories where one mistake meant 16 civilian bodies in a collapsed house. It is the practice of surviving by absorbing punishment without flinching. She'll quit, Whitfield says to the resident's back as the resident follows Katie out. They always do. But what he doesn't know, what he cannot possibly know standing in that fluorescent-lit break room with his overpriced watch and his conspiracy intact, is that Katie has been through far worse than a bet. She has been through Marja. She has been through interrogations by Pentagon investigators who wanted to know why 16 civilians died in a compound that was supposed to be abandoned. She has been through the kind of erasure that comes when you're no longer convenient to official history, when the government decides that the surgical lieutenant who ran a black ops extraction gone sideways is better off dissolved into civilian life where she can never testify. She has been through 8 years of being invisible. Katie Morrison doesn't quit. Katie Morrison survives. The lunch rush hits the ER at noon the next day like an impact, multiple traumas, 3 ambulances stacked in the bay, the waiting room full of people whose pain has finally reached the threshold where they can't ignore it anymore. Katie moves through the chaos with the fluid efficiency of someone who's operated under actual fire, hanging blood products with one hand while drawing labs with the other, her movements economical and precise. A patient coding in room for requires immediate attention. She inserts a central line through the subclavian vein with a steady hand, the needle going in without deviation, the guide wire threading exactly where it needs to go, fluid management that keeps the patient oxygenated while the attending makes decisions. The monitor starts showing organized rhythm. Katie doesn't celebrate. Organized rhythm is the baseline expectation. And then, at 12:06 p.m., while she's crossing the hallway with a tray of discharge medications and fresh bandages, Dr. Whitfield walks directly into her path. The collision isn't accidental. It's precise and controlled, the kind of movement that looks like coincidence to anyone not paying attention. The tray lifts out of Katie's hands. The medications scatter across the tile floor like confetti. The bandages follow. The sound echoes through the hallway, are not loud, but distinctive, the kind of noise that makes people turn their heads. "Careful," Whitfield says. He doesn't help. "We need those sorted." Katie stares at the debris for 2 seconds. Her hands are still extended, muscles remembering the weight that was just taken from them. Her breathing is steady. She lowers herself into a crouch without any hesitation, without any embarrassment, without any of the responses that Whitfield is waiting for. Her hands move with mechanical precision, collecting medications, checking for integrity, reassessing usability. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Whitfield adds, because the first move didn't generate the reaction he wanted. Because Katie's composure is a problem. Because he needs to see her break, needs to confirm his theory that she's unstable, needs evidence for the termination paperwork he's already planning. "And maybe the next time you'll watch where you're going." Katie picks up the scattered supplies. Her expression doesn't change. The other staff members who witnessed the collision pretend they didn't. They avert their eyes the way people do when confronted with something that might require them to take a side. Katie stands. The tray is no longer full, some items were contaminated, and she knows better than to reuse them. She carries what's salvageable back to the pharmacy. But that wasn't the worst part of what Whitfield just set in motion. Monday morning at 7:15, Dr. Whitfield announces his campaign during rounds. The break room falls silent. 8 staff members freeze mid-coffee, their cups suspended like they've been paused on film. "I'm betting $50 Morrison here doesn't make it to Friday," he says, his voice carrying that particular condescension reserved for people he's already decided don't belong. "Any takers?" Katie continues pouring creamer into her cup. Her hand doesn't shake. Her face reveals nothing, just hospital wallpaper, blank and forgettable. 2 nurses exchange glances but say nothing. Nobody takes the bet. Whitfield's smile hardens slightly at the silence, which only makes him worse. "Nothing personal, sweetheart, you just have that look. The quitter look." Katie sets the cup down and walks past him to the pharmacy, her movements economical, her jaw set like a surgical clamp on bone. She's heard worse in places where the worse meant something entirely different than this man could comprehend. By afternoon, the cafeteria has become a theater. Katie balances her tray past crowded tables during lunch rush, navigating the noise and the fluorescent glare, when Whitfield steps directly into her path. He pivots sharply, a deliberate collision disguised as carelessness. The tray launches from her hands. Silverware explodes across the tile in a spectacular crash, each piece clattering like spent shell casings. A bowl of soup spreads in a beige puddle across the floor, and 50 conversations stop simultaneously. The room goes dead silent. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Whitfield says loudly, stepping over the mess as if it's nothing. As if she's nothing. Katie kneels without hesitation, her face revealing absolutely nothing, gathering forks and knives with deliberate care. Her soup spreads further across the tile like something alive. A resident reluctantly brings paper towels, embarrassed to witness this, embarrassed for her. Katie doesn't look up. She doesn't acknowledge the humiliation. She doesn't flinch. That's what makes Whitfield furious, the fact that she won't give him the satisfaction of breaking her. Her composure isn't weakness. It's restraint. And it's far more powerful than anything he can say. Thursday rounds. Whitfield throws patient charts at her feet in front of the attending physician and 2 medical students. The gesture is so deliberately cruel that even the residents shift uncomfortably. These are filed wrong. Again. You'd think someone with your limited qualifications would at least manage basic alphabetization. The charts hit the floor with sharp slaps, the sound of authority being weaponized against her. Katie bends without comment, retrieves them one by one, checks each label methodically, and returns them to the correct slots. She's systematic. Precise. The kind of careful you develop when mistakes mean bodies. Her knuckles whiten briefly on the metal cart rail, the only crack in her composure. One moment. That's all she allows herself. The attending physician watches this and says nothing. The students learn a lesson about power dynamics that no ethics course will teach them. That evening, the supply closet becomes her sanctuary. Katie sits alone in the darkness for 12 minutes, surrounded by shelves of bandages and sterile gauze, her breathing controlled and deliberate. The vulnerability lasts only as long as the closed door. Her shoulders drop. Her clenched jaw releases. Her hands tremble, not from fear, but from the terrifying effort of restraint. The trembling wasn't weakness. It was the accumulated weight of holding everything together while someone tried to dismantle her piece by piece. She presses her palm against a scar on her ribs, a habit from caves where the darkness was absolute and there was no one coming to help. Here, there's fluorescent light bleeding under the door. But the loneliness feels exactly the same. She counts her breaths. 5 in. 7 out. The technique works everywhere: dusty compounds in Marja, back alley extractions, hospital supply closets in Philadelphia. Her hand stops shaking. Her face becomes blank again. When she opens the door and walks back onto the unit, the vulnerability is packed away so completely that it might have never existed. Katie notices the supply discrepancies on her 6th shift, Tuesday afternoon. She requisitions chest tubes for the trauma bay and finds the inventory system shows 40 units delivered last month but only 6 remain in stock. 40 chest tubes don't vanish. They're either being used or being billed to someone who never received them. She cross-references the billing codes during her lunch break using the hospital network terminal, tracing invoices that show equipment charged at triple markup to a contractor called MedSupply Solutions. $240 per chest tube. Times 40. She does the math quickly. $9,600 for equipment that the hospital received once. Everything about it smells like corruption, the way oil slicks the surface of water before you understand what's underneath. In room 347, Martinez watches her work with the kind of quiet recognition that only comes from survival. He's a wheelchair-bound Purple Heart veteran with a Special Forces officer's bearing, despite the fact that his legs ended somewhere in the mountains of Helmand Province. His chart reads, Retired Major, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. His eyes follow her movements with the precision of someone trained to read people in crisis. When she's adjusting his blood pressure cuff, he asks one question so quietly the machines almost swallow it, Marja. Katie's hands pause. Half a heartbeat. Nothing more. She doesn't answer, but her pause speaks volumes to anyone trained to hear it. His expression shifts, recognition layered on recognition, the kind that happens between people who've seen the same things and survived them differently. She finishes the vital signs and moves to the next patient. But Martinez has already understood. That night, Whitfield receives a call from Dennis Chen at MedSupply Solutions. The conversation lasts 90 seconds. Your new nurse has been asking questions about purchase orders, Chen says. It's not a warning. It's a threat disguised as information. Whitfield's response is immediate and methodical. He begins building Katie's termination file like he's constructing a case study. He documents a fabricated medication error, a near miss with a pediatric antibiotic dose that never actually occurred but that he has the pharmacy log as a legitimate concern. Her signature is forged on a documentation form. Emails flow from Whitfield to the nursing supervisor about concerning judgment calls and troubling patterns of oversight. The documentation is meticulous. Competent. A man who knows how to destroy someone through paperwork rather than confrontation. It's the behavior of someone who has done this before and gotten away with it. Katie finds the write-ups in her employee portal at 11 p.m. on Thursday night. She reads them 3 times because the details are so specific that they feel real, which is the point. She's seen this kind of coordinated pressure before, in places where people disappeared for asking the wrong questions. She recognizes the architecture of a takedown when it's being constructed around her. Her response is quiet and measured. She opens her laptop and begins her own documentation, photographing supply logs and billing records with her phone, creating timestamps, building her own case in the darkness of her apartment at midnight. If he's going to fabricate evidence, she'll create the real thing. The kitchen light is still on, cold coffee in a mug from 6 hours ago, untouched. Martinez wheels himself to the nurse's station at midnight on Friday, moving through hallways that are empty except for the night shift skeleton crew. He leaves a folded note in Katie's cubby, underneath a stack of shift reports. The note is 5 words: "I know who you are. Your son talked about you. Thank you for not turning away." Katie reads it twice, her breathing stopping completely on the second read. She knows exactly what he means. Her son came home from Marja with no legs and nightmares for company, and he spent 6 months before his overdose talking about his commanding officer, the one who carried him out of the Sanjan Valley under fire, who held pressure on wounds when medics were pinned down, who never let go. She burns the note in the parking lot trash barrel at 1 a.m., standing alone in the Philadelphia cold, watching the paper curl into ash and disappear. The smell of burning paper mixes with diesel exhaust from the ambulance bay. She doesn't stay to watch it burn completely. She walks back inside, where Dr. Whitfield is still building his case and Martinez is waiting in the darkness of room 347, and the truth is sitting between them all like an unexploded device, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to move it. The weekend arrives with rain. Actual, honest rain that hammers the parking lot like applause, and Katie wonders if Martinez is still awake, still thinking about her son, still carrying the weight of decisions that ended careers and changed families. Monday will bring new charts and new humiliations. But something has shifted. Martinez knows. And Katie knows that he knows. The supply fraud is documented. The lies are recorded. And somewhere in the darkness of a hospital that doesn't understand what it's harboring, a war is beginning between the people who hide things and the one person who refuses to disappear quietly. The 6th shift inventory report sat on Katie's clipboard like a confession written in red. 40 chest tube units logged as delivered last Thursday. Supply bay C shelves held 8. 32 units. Gone. She ran her finger down the manifest again, the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical prayer above her head, and the numbers didn't change. They never did. Katie stood in the supply closet at 2:17 a.m., the shelves stretching around her in ordered rows that suddenly felt like a crime scene. The trauma bay should have been restocked after the Saturday car accident, 3 MVAs, 2 of them critical. The chest tubes should have been depleted. They should have been. But the inventory system showed 40 arriving on a Thursday morning delivery from Meridian Medical Supply, the same vendor whose name appeared on 40 invoices across the past 8 weeks. 40. 80. 60. Numbers that climbed like a fever chart while the shelves stayed nearly empty. She didn't need a forensic accountant to understand what Dr. Whitfield was protecting. The pieces clicked into place with the precision of a rifle bolt sliding home. His sudden fury when she'd mentioned the supply discrepancies to the nursing supervisor. His face when she'd casually noted that the trauma bay trauma shears were dull, shouldn't be, given the recent delivery logs. His hand on her shoulder in the hallway, the grip just tight enough to communicate threat, "Don't take inventory personally, Morrison. It's not your job." The bet, the trays, the charts thrown at her feet, none of it was random cruelty. It was pressure. A test to see if she'd break, resign, disappear before she could notice what was vanishing from these shelves. Before she could ask questions the hospital's compliance officer would eventually have to answer. He wasn't trying to destroy her because she was competent. He was trying to destroy her because she was too competent to miss what he was stealing. Katie closed the inventory system on the supply cart computer and stepped out of the closet at 2:21 a.m. The hallway was empty except for the sound of the ventilator in room 347, that mechanical wheeze that had become as familiar as her own breathing over the past 6 shifts. Martinez was still awake. He rarely slept deeply, the way soldiers didn't sleep when they were in places their bodies remembered as dangerous. She could see his silhouette through the window, his chair positioned at an angle toward the window where he could watch the Philadelphia night. She checked his monitor first. Heart rate hovering around 68. BP stable. O2 sat holding at 97%. Then she noticed the irregular blips on the EKG line. Not dangerous. Not yet. But present. Like a stutter in his rhythm. How long? She asked, pulling up his vitals on the bedside monitor. Since you left, Martinez said. His voice carried the same careful modulation it always did, the trained tone of someone who'd learned to speak without giving anything away. Started about 20 minutes after your rounds. Nothing major. Katie nodded, the motion economical, precise. She'd recognized something else in Martinez over the past week, the way he watched her move through the hospital, the weight of recognition behind his dark eyes. The way his gaze had followed her on the third day when she dropped a bedpan and didn't flinch at the crash. Officers knew other officers. They saw the bearing, the discipline, the way someone carried themselves when they'd spent years carrying other people's lives. I need to tell you something, Martinez said quietly. Before you hear it from someone else. Before this place gets any worse for you. Katie's hand stilled on the 4 line. She didn't turn around. Whatever he was about to say, she already knew it would change the shape of her grief, and she wasn't prepared for that particular surgery. Marja, he said. 2009, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse Company. You know those words. Katie closed her eyes. She did. She knew them the way survivors knew the names of their disasters. Your son was attached to our unit, Martinez continued, his voice steady as a pulse. We were running a classified extraction operation, something the Pentagon wanted very quiet. An informant we needed out, location that was hot, Taliban fighters moving in from 2 different valleys. Your boy was our convoy security. Good soldier. Smart. Paid attention. Martinez paused. When the IED hit, it took the left side of the Humvee. He was in the rear gunner position. Katie's shoulders didn't move. Her breathing didn't change. She was stone. She was professional. She was the version of herself that didn't exist before she learned to compartmentalize shrapnel and carry it in sealed containers deep enough that no one could see the damage. I pulled him out, Martinez said. Carried him 2 miles under fire while the rest of the convoy provided cover. His legs were gone below the knees, but his head was clear. He was conscious. And the last thing he said to me before they loaded him on the medevac bird, the absolute last thing, was tell my mom I made it count. Not tell her I'm sorry. Not to tell her I love her. Tell her I made it count. Your son understood what he was part of, and he went into that valley knowing the cost. Katie turned then, slowly. Martinez was reaching into the drawer beside his bed, his hand emerging with something wrapped in a cloth so worn it had turned the color of old blood. He pulled back the fabric and Katie saw them, combat boots. Desert tan. Scuffed leather that had walked through sand and blood and consequence. The laces were knotted at the ends where they'd been cut, field expedient. The soles were worn thin on the left heel, which meant he'd favored that leg when he was hurt, when weight was pain, when walking was an act of war against his own body. He wore these home, Martinez said quietly. I couldn't throw them away. They carried him out of that valley. So I kept them. I've kept them for 14 years, and I look at them every time I think about the men I couldn't save. Katie felt the tear before she understood her face could produce one. It tracked down her left cheek like a tracer round, a single bright line of something that had been sealed for 14 years. She wiped it away with 2 fingers, clinical efficiency, the way you'd clear fluid from a patient's airway. She didn't cry. Master Chief Petty officers didn't cry in hospital rooms in front of men who'd carried their sons through fire. But she had been wrong. She had spent 14 years blaming this man for the cost of sacrifice, when all he'd done was survive it the same way her son had, with purpose, with understanding, with the knowledge that some things were worth the price. His name was Michael, Katie said. Her voice was flat, factual, a voice reading vitals aloud. Michael James Morrison. He wanted to be a physical therapist. Help other soldiers reintegrate. He would have been good at it, Martinez said. He had the temperament. The patience. He understood that broken things could still become useful things. Katie adjusted his fur-line with hands that were steady again. The irregular blips on his EKG monitor continued their pattern, ectopic beats, nothing critical, just his heart reminding him it was working, that it was still beating in a body that had survived what it wasn't supposed to survive. She'd seen 1,000 hearts in her career. Known 1,000 rhythms. But this rhythm felt different. This rhythm was telling her something about forgiveness, about the way grief could calcify into blame until someone opened that sealed container and showed you what was actually inside. We need to monitor you closely, she said. The arrhythmia could develop. I'm staying with you for the next 2 hours. I know, Martinez said. He knew. That was the thing about officers, they always knew. Katie pulled the chair from the corner and positioned it where she could watch both Martinez and his monitor, where she could track the blips and the beats and the measured rise and fall of his oxygen saturation. She opened her phone and made a note in his chart, occasional premature atrial contractions noted at 0240 hours. Hemodynamically stable. Patient alert and oriented. Monitoring continues. The words were clinical. The act was something else entirely. At 3:27 a.m., 22 minutes after Katie had begun her vigil beside Martinez's bed, Dr. Whitfield's phone rang in his home office in the Rittenhouse Square townhouse he'd purchased on the salary he'd built from Phantom Equipment invoices. He listened to the compliance officer, listened to the explanation about the credential verification failure, listened to the phrase that would reshape his entire calculus, external investigation. Someone had triggered the audit. Someone had asked questions about Katie Morrison that reached the Pentagon. Dr. Whitfield hung up the phone and made 3 calls to board members, men he'd golfed with, men whose children's medical school tuitions he'd helped finance through grants that came from phantom billing kickbacks. He made them understand that this nurse was a liability. He made them understand that if she wasn't removed before Monday morning, if she wasn't discredited before the compliance officer could deepen his investigation, everything would unravel. The 4th call was to the military reference number on Katie's original employment application. The number that should verify her credentials. The number that existed in bureaucratic limbo between classified and non-existent. A voice answered on the 2nd ring. Male. Federal. The tone of someone who managed secrets for a living. I'm calling to verify the employment history of one of my nursing staff, Dr. Whitfield said. Katie Morrison. I need confirmation of her military medical service. The silence lasted 3 seconds. No, Katie Morrison served in any medical capacity, the voice said flatly. This number is no longer in service. The line went dead. Dr. Whitfield smiled and began typing the memo that would initiate Katie Morrison's termination process. Credential fraud. Employment history fabrication. A liability that would be removed by Monday morning, suspended pending investigation, destroyed before she could unravel everything he'd spent 8 years building. What happened next didn't just silence the room. What happened next was going to change the weight of every truth Katie Morrison carried. The monitor screamed at 2:38 a.m. on Sunday. Katie heard it from the supply room, 3 floors above, but the alarm carried through St. Michael's like a siren cutting through fog. She knew that pitch. Knew exactly what it meant. The cardiac monitor doesn't shriek like that for rhythm irregularities or simple tachycardia. That was the sound of a heart being crushed from the inside. She was moving before her conscious mind caught up. Room 347. Martinez. The ICU hallway was chaos in that specific way only medical crises create, controlled panic, everyone knowing their role but the air itself feeling pressurized, like the building was holding its breath. Katie pushed through the cluster of nurses gathering at the door and saw him immediately. Martinez's chest heaving. His oxygen saturation dropping in real time on the monitor, 94, 89, 84. His blood pressure flatlined like someone had pulled the power cord, 68/40 and falling. The telemetry showed sinus rhythms struggling against something invisible, something crushing his heart with the force of a fist. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid in the pericardium. Blood pooling in the sac surrounding his heart, compressing the ventricles, stopping them from filling, stopping them from pumping. Every heartbeat was fighting against a tightening vice. "Where's cardiothoracic?" Katie's voice came out level, quiet, the kind of calm that makes people listen. The resident, a young man named Chen who looked 17, checked his pager. 20 minutes. Stuck on IU-95. 20 minutes. Martinez had maybe 8 before his pressure dropped below viable. Before his brain started dying from lack of oxygen. Before the cascade became irreversible. Katie was already moving toward the supply room. She knew this hospital's layout like she'd walked these corridors for 18 years instead of 3 weeks. The pericardiocentesis kit was in the crash cart, 18-gauge needle, ultrasound probe, the supplies of someone who'd done this in caves under mortar fire, who'd done this in darkness with shaking hands and the knowledge that failure meant watching someone die. "We're doing a bedside tap," she said. Not a question. Not a suggestion. "We can't," Chen said. The attending isn't here. Martinez is dying right now." Katie was already uncapping the ultrasound probe, her fingers moving with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory burned into bone. 10-second window. Move. She positioned the probe over Martinez's fifth intercostal space, the needle held between her teeth like she was back in that cave outside Marja with incoming fire and a casualty who needed a line or a body bag. The ultrasound screen showed exactly what she expected, the dark fluid surrounding his heart like a shadow, compression visible even on ultrasound. She could see his ventricles struggling. "Hold him still," she said. The nurses stabilized Martinez's chest. Katie pulled the needle from her mouth and inserted the catheter with one smooth motion, between the ribs, past the pleural membrane, into the pericardial sac. The resistance changed. She knew that feeling. Knew it like knowing her own name. The blood came back dark and thick. 200 ccs. Then another 100. The fluid drained like opening a valve on something that had been pressurizing for hours. Martinez's blood pressure climbed. 72, 78, 84, 92. The oxygen saturation rose in tandem, 86, 91, 94, 97. The monitor shifted from the shrieking chaos of tamponade to the steady rhythm of a heart that could finally pump. It took 90 seconds total. The cardiothoracic surgeon burst through the doors at minute 2, already gloved, already moving toward the bed with the expression of someone bracing for intubation and emergency surgery. He saw Martinez's vitals on the monitor and stopped mid-stride. Saw the syringe in Katie's hands. Saw the sample of blood she'd just extracted from a chest cavity that shouldn't have been touched. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Dr. Whitfield's voice came from directly behind her, sharp as broken glass. Katie set down the syringe with careful precision. She turned to face him, still in her street clothes. She'd been called in at 2:08 a.m., hadn't even changed yet. Her eyes met his with absolute calm. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world can offer. "Saving his life," she said. Whitfield's jaw tightened. His hands clenched at his sides. For a moment, Katie could see the full architecture of his rage, not just the anger of a man whose authority had been challenged, but something deeper. Fear. The fear of a man who'd just watched someone do something he thought impossible, something that revealed capabilities he'd been too stupid to recognize. The surgeon looked between them. "Who did the procedure?" "I did," Katie said. He nodded slowly. "Proper technique. Excellent access point. You've done this before." "Yes," Katie said. Whitfield moved toward the door, his face a mask of controlled fury. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Katie could see it in the way his hand shook as he pulled out his phone, in the way his breathing had gone shallow and quick. By 3:15 a.m., security was walking her out of the building. By dawn, she was suspended. Whitfield had called an emergency board session before the sun rose on Sunday. He'd activated 3 board members who owed him favors, one from the surgery residency program at Temple, another who'd helped him secure his position 8 years prior, a third who appeared regularly at the country club where Whitfield played 18 holes every Saturday. He'd filed a formal complaint citing unauthorized procedures outside her scope of practice, potential credential fraud, and endangerment of patient safety. He'd also placed a call to a reference number Katie had provided during her hiring, a Pentagon administrative office in Arlington, Virginia, the kind of office that exists on organizational charts but never answers phones, the kind of office that coordinates the disappearance of people who know too much. The call went through. The person who answered was polite and professional and gave absolutely nothing away. Yes, they said. A compliance review could be arranged. No, they couldn't comment on personnel matters. The reference would be checked. A report would be filed. What they didn't say, what they couldn't say, was that Katie Morrison's name had been flagged in their system the moment the query came through. That 3 layers of Pentagon protocol activated immediately. That her file was being pulled from a classified archive where it had sat untouched for 4 years, ever since the incident in Marja that killed 16 civilians in Crossfire and got buried so deep that even the Joint Chiefs didn't have full access to it. Katie didn't know any of that yet. She sat in an all-night diner called Rose's at 3 a.m. on Monday morning, the suspension papers still folded in her bag, her scrubs abandoned in a locker at St. Michael's because she didn't trust herself to walk back in there just yet. The coffee in front of her had gone cold an hour ago. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that specific sound that only diner lights make, a sound like the whole world was buzzing just slightly out of sync with reality. The diner was nearly empty. A trucker at the counter paid his bill and left, the door closing behind him with a pneumatic hiss. The waitress, older, kind eyes, a nameplate that read Dorothy, refilled Katie's cup without asking if she wanted it. "Rough night?" Dorothy said. Katie didn't answer. She was staring at her reflection in the dark window, the glass acting like a mirror in the pre-dawn darkness. She looked like a ghost. Looked like someone who'd been erased and was only now noticing it. The thought that kept cycling through her mind was simple and terrible. She'd broken 17 years of protocol to save one man's life. One disabled veteran who couldn't even walk. One man she'd blamed for 4 years until she'd seen the boots, the same boots her son had worn home from Marja, the same boots Martinez wore into a war that took his legs and destroyed her family twice over. And in saving him, she destroyed the anonymity that kept her alive. The invisibility the Pentagon had ordered her into. The disappearance that was the only mercy they'd offered her after the extraction went wrong and 16 civilians died and the Pentagon needed the incident buried, and the only way to do that was to erase the one person who could testify about what actually happened. She'd walked away from that life on Pentagon orders. Walked away from her rank, her records, her identity. Became just a nurse in just a hospital in just a city where no one asked questions. And 4 weeks in, she'd blown it all apart by moving on instinct. The silence in the diner was the kind of silence that happens in the hour before dawn, when the city is holding its breath and waiting to be born again. Katie wondered if the Pentagon would let her disappear again. Wondered if there was enough institutional goodwill left to offer her another life, another identity, another hospital in another city. Wondered if she'd even want it. The sound didn't arrive until 11:38 a.m. on Monday, but it came the way all major sounds come to hospitals. Not gradually. All at once. The rotor wash hammered across St. Michael's like something alive, shaking windows on the 4th floor hard enough to make patients press their faces against the glass. The Black Hawk descended with military precision toward the helipad, a UH-60M painted in army gray, its nose heavy, its presence absolute. The landing was textbook perfect. The doors opened. 2 Marines in dress blues emerged first, their uniforms so crisp they looked laminated, white covers, blue jackets with gold buttons, ribbons blazing in colors that meant things Katie could read in her sleep. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Navy Commendation Medal. The full regalia of people who'd been to the wars and come back changed. They walked through St. Michael's main entrance like they owned it. The security desk had a veteran named Williams behind it, former Army sergeant, about 60, missing the index finger on his left hand from an IED in 2004. The taller Marine approached and spoke in the kind of clear, measured tone that carried authority without volume. "We're here for Reaper 6, he said. Williams went absolutely still. His hand started toward a salute before he caught himself, but the damage was done. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, "Master Chief Petty Officer." The reverence in those 3 words was enough to kill sound in the hallway. Nurses froze mid-stride. A janitor stopped pushing his cart. A visitor asking directions to radiology stopped mid-sentence. The crowd parted instinctively, the way crowds do when authority enters a room. Dr. Whitfield emerged from his office 20 seconds later, confusion crossing his face. He didn't understand what was happening. He didn't have the context to read the room. The 2-star general walked in behind the Marines, Brigadier General Patricia Halloway, her uniform immaculate, her bearing the kind of absolute authority that comes from commanding thousands of lives across multiple tours. She moved directly to the center of the lobby. Hospital staff had gathered in clusters. Visitors stared. Security repositioned. The crowd grew as word spread through the hospital, something was happening. Something official. Something that made even doctors listen. General Halloway opened a folder. Her voice was trained to carry across parade grounds, and it carried easily across a hospital lobby filled with 70 people. "Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison," she began. 17 combat tours in Iraq, Afghanistan, and classified locations. 43 lives saved under fire in conditions where other medics refused to deploy. Navy Cross recipient for actions during a 12-day siege in Helmand Province, 2019, where she held a unit of 12 Special Forces operators together when enemy forces overran the position and command abandoned them. The silence was absolute. You could hear the fax system. You could hear breathing. You could hear someone's pager vibrating silently in their pocket. She performed emergency field amputations in caves with no anesthesia beyond battlefield morphine. She extracted wounded under sustained fire from multiple directions. She is the surgeon who trained other medics in trauma protocols that became standard across SOCOM. The general looked up from the citation. She held people's lives together with her own 2 hands when everything else failed. 10 seconds passed. 15. 20. Then Martinez wheeled himself out of the ICU elevator, his chair gliding through the parted crowd like something inevitable. He moved to the center of the lobby and stopped directly in front of Katie, who stood at the back of the gathering, still in her street clothes, her face unreadable except for the tears she wasn't bothering to hide. Martinez's voice cracked slightly but carried with the weight of testimony. 3 years ago, she donated her kidney to my daughter. Anonymously. Tracked down the medical registry, matched her blood type to Emma's, flew to San Diego on her own money, and had the surgery done without telling anyone. Emma had 6 months without a transplant. She saved her life. She couldn't save my legs in Marja, that was my responsibility as a commanding officer, but she saved my child. The compliance officer stepped forward, Patricia Chen, the gray-haired woman who'd been investigating Katie's credentials since Sunday morning. She held up a tablet and addressed the crowd with a kind of calm that only comes from delivering terrible news to people who deserve it. The investigation initiated into Katie Morrison's credentials triggered a deeper audit of surgical supply billing through MedSupply Solutions, she said. We uncovered fraudulent charges totaling $847,000 over 23 months. Inflated equipment costs, phantom inventory, bulk billing for supplies never delivered. She looked directly at Dr. Whitfield. These charges were authorized by a single physician. Federal charges are being filed this afternoon. Your medical license has been referred for emergency revocation proceedings. The crowd erupted, not in applause, but in the kind of stunned murmur that happens when the world shifts on its axis. Staff members turned to stare at Whitfield, whose face had gone the color of hospital sheets. He backed toward the exit with the expression of a man watching his life collapse in real time, watching the institution he'd spent 8 years building recognize him as a fraud. Katie stood motionless in the back of the lobby. The general looked at her across 70 people. Martinez looked at her from his chair. The nurses who'd watched her bend to retrieve scattered silverware without flinching looked at her. Williams, the security guard, looked at her with the kind of recognition that only comes from one veteran seeing another. General Holloway stepped forward and extended her hand. Katie took it, her grip steady, her voice level when she finally spoke. "Your orders, hmm?" The general smiled. "Go home. Rest. You've earned it, Master Chief." The room held that moment like a breath before letting it go. The compliance officer's office smelled like burnt coffee and fresh printer paper. He sat across from Katie with a folder thick as a surgical textbook, his expression the kind of careful neutrality that means bad news is coming in waves. His name was Brennan, 15 years in hospital fraud investigation, a man whose job was to find what people hid. He'd found plenty. "Your credentials," he said. "Naval Medical Corps. Service years listed as 2005 to 2019. Rank listed as," he paused, checking the document. "Master Chief Petty Officer. Surgical specialty in trauma." Katie didn't move. Her hands rested flat on the table between them, the same hands that had withdrawn fluid from Martinez's pericardium at 2:38 in the morning. Hands that had been trained in caves and bunkers and field hospitals where the difference between a steady grip and a trembling one meant whether someone's child came home whole or in pieces. "I made a call," Brennan continued. "Pentagon contact. Direct line." He turned the folder around to face her. "They say no Katie Morrison served in any medical capacity. Not in the Navy. Not in naval special warfare. Not anywhere. The contact I spoke to, a colonel named Hayes," he said it very calmly, "said, Katie Morrison doesn't exist in any system we maintain." Then he hung up. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical prayer above them. Katie watched Brennan's face and said nothing. "So I went deeper." His fingers drummed the folder once, twice. "Looking for something. Anything. Records get deleted, Katie. They get purged. They get redacted so thoroughly that the only proof they ever existed is the shape of the absence they leave behind." He opened the folder. Inside was a single page, mostly black ink, redaction marks bleeding across sentences like spilled oil. One phrase visible: Black Ops extraction. Marja District. Civilian casualties. 16 confirmed. Katie's jaw tightened. Just barely. Just enough that Brennan saw it. "Your military contact," she said. Her voice was steady as a metronome. "What else did he say?" "That you were ordered to disappear. Into civilian life. Where you couldn't testify." Brennan leaned back. "That the Pentagon doesn't erase people's records unless something catastrophic happened. Unless someone knows too much." He closed the folder slowly. "I'm supposed to file this as credential fraud. Recommend your termination. That's my job." Katie waited. "But I'm not going to do that," Brennan said. "Because I've spent 15 years watching people hide things. And the ones who hide things for the Pentagon? They don't do it because they're criminals. They do it because someone made them." He stood. "This investigation is closed. And Katie Morrison stays exactly as hidden as she needs to be." She left his office at 11 in the evening, after her shift ended, her badge clipped to her scrubs, her name visible to everyone who looked. But invisibility isn't about what people can see. It's about what they refuse to look at. 3 hours later, she sat in an all-night diner called Mel's on Roosevelt Boulevard, the kind of place where the coffee tastes like it was brewed yesterday and the server doesn't ask questions about the woman in nurse's scrubs staring at a mug gone cold. The window reflected her back to herself, a face that belonged to no one. A face that had been erased so thoroughly that the Pentagon itself had forgotten how to spell her name. She thought about Martinez lying in that hospital bed with tamponade fluid crushing his heart, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone, the surgical team frozen and the on-call surgeon 20 minutes away. She thought about the needle in her hand finding the fifth intercostal space, finding the fluid that was killing him, finding the moment where one decision separated his living daughter from his dead one. She thought about whether saving one man's life was worth losing the invisibility that had kept her alive. The diner's radio played old country songs nobody listened to anymore. Rain hammered the parking lot like artillery, and Katie didn't move. She just waited for dawn. The Black Hawk landed on St. Michael's helipad at noon exactly, its rotors shaking windows 3 floors down, sending nurses to the hallways to watch. 2 Marines in dress uniforms walked through the emergency department doors like gravity had changed direction, and they were the only ones who understood the new rules. Their faces were carved from the kind of focus that comes from knowing exactly what they're walking toward and exactly why it matters. They approached the administrative desk and asked for Reaper 6 by her call sign. The security guard, a veteran named Tommy who'd done 2 tours in Fallujah with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, snapped to attention like someone had pulled a string in his spine. He whispered Master Chief Petty Officer with the kind of reverence that silences hallways, that makes nurses pause mid-stride, that transforms a name from a credential into a legend. Katie was in Trauma Bay 3 charting when she heard the commotion. She didn't look up immediately. She finished the note, blood loss, transfusion count, vitals stable, because that was the job. But her hands moved slower than they should have. Her breath came quieter. She turned. The hallway had filled with hospital staff, and at the center stood a 2-star general with ribbons on his chest that represented wars before some of these nurses were born. He opened a folder, not redacted, not hidden, but authorized and official and real, and he began reading aloud in a voice like a tank idling in a garage. Katie Morrison. 17 combat tours. 43 lives saved under hostile fire. He paused. The hospital held its breath. Navy Cross recipient. The surgeon who held together a unit through a week-long siege when command abandoned them. Who performed emergency field surgery with no support. Who made decisions that saved the lives of soldiers who should have died in that valley. Katie didn't move. Her composure was so absolute it became its own kind of power. Then Martinez wheeled himself to the center of the crowd. His prosthetics caught the fluorescent light as he moved, new technology, VA-funded, the kind of legs the military gives you when they finally admit what they took. He looked at Katie directly and he spoke loud enough for every person in that hallway to hear. She donated her kidney to my daughter 3 years ago. Anonymous. No one knew. No one needed to know. She couldn't save my legs, but she saved Emma's life. His voice cracked once, recovered. She's the reason my daughter's alive. The reason my daughter will graduate high school and go to college and maybe become a doctor herself. That's what Reaper 6 does. That's who Katie Morrison is. The room held 10 seconds of absolute silence. The kind of silence that only happens when everyone understands they've been standing next to a legend without knowing her name. Then Brennan, the compliance officer, stepped forward and spoke quietly to the board members standing frozen in the hallway. The investigation into Katie's credentials accidentally uncovered a billing fraud network. Phantom equipment billing. Kickback scheme spanning 2 years. Total fraudulent revenue, $847,000. Federal charges pending. Medical license under suspension pending revocation. Dr. Whitfield wasn't in the hallway. He'd already heard. He'd already started clearing out his office, his hands shaking as he removed plaques and photographs, erasing himself from the walls he'd worked to dominate for 7 years. 6 months later, Katie walked past a strip mall on Roosevelt Boulevard with groceries heavy in her arms, her day off spent doing ordinary things in an extraordinary way. She wasn't looking for anything when she saw the folding table outside a vacant storefront. The banner was sun-faded, the letters cracked from months in Philadelphia Sun, auto insurance, low rates. Dr. Whitfield sat behind it in a wrinkled polo shirt, his face unshaven, his eyes hollow. He'd lost weight. He'd lost his house in the divorce. He'd lost his medical license and his position and his reputation and everything he'd built on the backs of people he'd treated like insects. Now he sat at a folding table selling insurance to people with bad credit histories, which was appropriate because he had the worst credit history of anyone in that shopping district. He looked up as Katie passed. Their eyes met for 1 second. Maybe 2. She didn't stop. She didn't slow. She didn't nod or acknowledge him or spare him the mercy of recognition. She kept walking forward like he was part of the scenery, part of the background noise, part of the things that don't matter anymore. 30 feet behind her, Martinez approached on his prosthetics. The limp was barely noticeable now. His wheelchair sat in his garage at home, retired from active duty like a soldier earning his discharge. He caught Katie's eye and nodded once, the kind of nod soldiers share when words aren't enough and everything else has already been said. Katie nodded back. That evening, in her living room, the shadow box hung beside her nursing diploma and the framed photograph of her son in desert fatigues. The worn combat boots rested inside, preserved behind glass, a memorial to the mission that cost him his legs and cost her 14 years of misplaced grief. Martinez's daughter Emma, 11 years old now, healthy, her kidney function perfect at every checkup, had sent a birthday card with a drawing of a heart and a nurse's hat in blue crayon. Katie taped it to her refrigerator beside the photograph of Martinez taking his first unassisted steps. The next morning at St. Michael's, she arrived early for her shift and found a new nurse struggling with a difficult for insertion on an elderly patient with fragile vasculature. Katie kneeled beside her, guided her hands, demonstrated the technique with patient precision, and said, "You'll get it. Just takes practice." The young nurse looked at her with gratitude and something like awe. Katie returned to her cart. Her badge was clipped straight now. Her name was visible. She didn't hide anymore because she didn't need to. The invisibility had served its purpose. It had kept her alive while she learned to live. Now she could be seen. If you haven't already, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss when we drop these stories. Leave a comment below. What would you have done in Katie's position? Would you have saved him or walked away? And share this story with someone who needs to know that quiet strength matters, that the ones who've survived the worst often have the most to give. Thanks for watching.